It was a warm summer evening in the small town of Hartsville, the kind of place where everyone knew each other, or at least thought they did. The streets were quiet, lined with neat little houses and picket fences, but behind the facade of serenity, tensions simmered. The new guy in town, Marcus King, had turned more than a few heads. He was a tall, broad-shouldered black man with a quiet demeanor that only added to the mystery surrounding him. Marcus had moved into a modest house on the edge of town a month ago, keeping mostly to himself. While the locals speculated endlessly about his past, Marcus didn't offer much. He spent his days fixing up the house, running errands, and occasionally walking his aging dog, Max, through the neighborhood. But not everyone welcomed Marcus. A group of men who considered themselves the town's self-proclaimed protectors didn't like the idea of an outsider settling in, especially one who didn't fit their image of Hartsville. They were loud, brash, and filled with hatred they barely bothered to hide. They called themselves the Greybacks, a name they thought sounded intimidating, but to Marcus they were just bullies looking for a target. It started with small things, snide comments as Marcus passed by, trash thrown onto his lawn, and a slashed tire on his truck. Marcus didn't react. He fixed what needed fixing, cleaned up what needed cleaning, and carried on. The lack of a response seemed to enrage the Greybacks even more. They wanted a reaction. They wanted him to fight back, so they could justify their anger. But Marcus remained calm, almost as if he were waiting. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon and shadows stretched across the town, Marcus returned home to find a hateful message spray-painted in red across his garage door. The words were crude and venomous, meant to provoke him. Marcus stood there for a moment, staring at the graffiti. His jaw tightened, but he didn't say a word. Instead, he grabbed a bucket of paint from the garage and began covering the message in broad, deliberate strokes. From the shadows, a pair of eyes watched. Jared, the leader of the Greybacks, leaned against his truck, smirking. "He's just going to take it," he muttered to one of his buddies. Coward. But Jared didn't know who he was dealing with. Inside the house, Marcus carefully locked the doors and sat at the kitchen table. On the surface, he seemed composed, but his eyes told a different story. There was a storm brewing behind them, one he was struggling to keep at bay. He opened a drawer and pulled out a worn photo. It was a picture of him in uniform, surrounded by a team of men in tactical gear. Each face in the photo was etched with determination and grit. Marcus traced a finger over the image, his expression softening for a brief moment before the steely resolve returned. This wasn't the first time Marcus had faced hostility, but he had learned long ago that some battles weren't worth fighting until they were. He wasn't just a man with a quiet life and a tragic past. He was a Navy SEAL, one of the most elite soldiers in the world. He had been trained to survive, to adapt, and to neutralize threats with precision. The Greybacks had no idea what they were about to unleash. As night fell, the air in Hartsville grew heavy, almost electric. A storm was coming, though not the kind that could be seen on a weather radar. The Greybacks, emboldened by what they saw as Marcus's passivity, decided it was time to send a clearer message. They gathered in Jared's garage, drinking and laughing as they hatched their plan. It was reckless, dangerous, and stupid, but that was how they operated. Around midnight, the Greybacks crept through the darkness, carrying cans of gasoline and lighters. They surrounded Marcus's house, their laughter hushed but brimming with malice. Jared gave the signal, and flames roared to life, consuming the edges of the home. Smoke billowed into the night sky as the men stood back, admiring their handiwork. But Marcus wasn't in the house. From the tree line, just beyond the reach of the firelight, Marcus watched silently. His face was unreadable, but his posture was tense, coiled like a spring. He didn't call for help. He didn't shout or scream. Instead, he melted back into the shadows, his mind already calculating his next move. As the flames illuminated the night, the Greybacks laughed, unaware that they had just crossed a line they couldn't uncross. Marcus had spent years dismantling threats far greater than a group of small-town bullies. He had promised himself he wouldn't go back to that life, that he would leave the violence behind. But now they had made it personal. And Marcus King was about to remind them why he had been one of the most dangerous men in the world. The night stretched on as the flames devoured what had been Marcus's home. The greybacks, basking in the glow of destruction, slapped each other on the back, their laughter echoing into the empty streets. They thought they had won, that they had scared off the outsider who dared to settle in their town. But none of them noticed the pair of eyes watching from the darkness, cold and calculating. Marcus crouched low behind the trees, his body tense but still. Years of training had taught him patience, the kind that could make time feel like it stopped altogether. He studied the men carefully, the way they moved, how they spoke, even the way they held their lighters. Everything about them was loud and sloppy, the opposite of the disciplined and dangerous men he'd faced in his past. But that didn't make them any less of a threat. Reckless people were often the most dangerous, their unpredictability a weapon in itself. Marcus's mind drifted back to another time, another life. It had been almost 5 years since he left the Navy, but the memories still clung to him like shadows. He had seen things, done things that most people couldn't imagine. Missions that required precision, stealth, and the ability to make life or death decisions in the blink of an eye. It wasn't a life he missed, but the skills he had gained during those years were now etched into his very being. They were a part of him, whether he liked it or not. When he left the service, all Marcus had wanted was peace. He wanted to put the violence behind him, to forget the faces of the men he had lost and the enemies he had taken down. Moving to Hartsville had been a calculated choice, a quiet town where he could rebuild his life, far away from the chaos of his past. He had chosen this place for its stillness, its promise of normalcy. But the greybacks had shattered that illusion, and now they had woken a part of Marcus he had hoped to bury forever. As the fire crackled and roared, Marcus slipped away, moving silently through the woods. He knew the police would arrive eventually, but he also knew they wouldn't do much. Small-town politics were as predictable as they were frustrating. Jared and his crew had connections, family ties that ran deep in Hartsville. Any investigation would be slow and justice would be watered down by excuses and favors. Marcus couldn't count on the system to protect him or hold these men accountable. He would have to handle this himself. By the time Marcus reached the edge of the woods, the fire trucks were pulling up, their sirens piercing the night. The greybacks scattered like cockroaches, laughing as they disappeared into the shadows. Marcus watched from a safe distance, his face unreadable. He wasn't angry, not in the way the greybacks might have expected. Anger was a waste of energy. What Marcus felt was something deeper, a cold resolve that settled in his chest like a stone. He needed to think, to plan. This wasn't just about his house. The greybacks had made it clear that they weren't going to stop until they drove him out. Or worse. And Marcus wasn't the kind of man who ran from a fight. Not anymore. He made his way to a small motel on the outskirts of town, paying for a room in cash and using a fake name. The woman behind the counter didn't ask questions, though her curious gaze lingered on him a little too long. Once inside the room, Marcus locked the door and closed the blinds. He sat on the edge of the bed, his mind racing as he pieced together the situation. Jared. He was the leader, the one who called the shots. Marcus had seen men like him before, arrogant, insecure, and desperate for control. Jared's crew followed him because they were too weak to stand on their own. Together, they fed off each other's hate, their group a toxic echo chamber that gave them a sense of power. But Marcus knew their type all too well. They weren't as strong as they wanted the world to believe. Underneath the bravado, they were cowards. Reaching into his duffel bag, Marcus pulled out an old notebook. It was worn and frayed at the edges, its pages filled with scribbled notes and diagrams. This was his playbook, a collection of strategies and tactics he had developed over the years. It wasn't just for combat, it was for survival. He flipped through the pages, his finger tracing over old entries, each one a reminder of a mission long past. Finally, he stopped on a blank page and picked up a pen. He started writing, listing names, details, and observations. Jared, the hothead; Tom, the lanky one with a nervous twitch; Billy, the one who always looked to Jared for approval. Marcus remembered each of their faces, the way they carried themselves. Everything mattered: the way they stood, the way they talked, even the way they held their drinks. People revealed more about themselves in their smallest habits than they ever realized. By the time the sun began to rise, Marcus had a plan. It wasn't about revenge. That wasn't his style. This was about sending a message, about making it clear that he wasn't a man to be trifled with. The Greybacks thought they had the upper hand because they didn't know who they were dealing with. Marcus intended to change that. He left the motel early, blending into the morning crowd as he gathered what he needed. A few tools from the hardware store, some basic supplies from the grocery store. Nothing that would raise suspicion, but everything had a purpose. Marcus moved with the quiet confidence of a man who had done this many times before. Each step, each action, was deliberate. As he drove back to the edge of town, his thoughts lingered on the Greybacks. He didn't hate them, not in the way they probably hated him. To Marcus, they were just another obstacle, another challenge to overcome. But he couldn't deny the satisfaction he felt knowing that they had no idea what was coming. By the time night fell again, Marcus was ready. He had set the pieces in motion, each one carefully placed to ensure the Greybacks would see exactly what he wanted them to see. He wasn't going to fight them on their terms. That would be too easy, too predictable. Instead, Marcus would use the skills that had kept him alive in the most dangerous places on Earth. He would make them question everything they thought they knew about him, about themselves. And when it was over, they would understand one thing: Marcus King was not a man to cross. The following evening, Hartsville's streets were quiet again, the faint hum of crickets filling the air. Marcus moved like a shadow, blending into the darkness with practiced ease. His movements were smooth, deliberate, and silent, the kind of silence that made a person question whether someone had ever been there at all. He wasn't heading to confront the Greybacks, not yet. That would come in time. For now, he needed to understand them better, to know their routines and weaknesses. He had always believed that information was the most powerful weapon a man could wield. Marcus started with Jared. The self-proclaimed leader of the Greybacks lived in a run-down house on the edge of town. It was the kind of place that told a story without words: junk scattered across the yard, an old truck with mismatched doors parked in the driveway, and a sagging porch that seemed to groan under its own weight. Through a crack in the curtains, Marcus could see Jared sprawled on the couch, a beer in hand, the glow of the television flickering against his face. Jared was shouting at the screen, cursing at some reality show contestant who wasn't living up to his expectations. From where Marcus stood, it was almost laughable. This was the man who thought he could intimidate him. But Marcus wasn't underestimating him. Jared's bravado wasn't just for show. It was a tool, a way to keep his crew loyal and obedient. Marcus had seen men like him before. They thrived on fear and control. And when that control was threatened, they became dangerous. Around midnight, Jared's front door creaked open, and another man stepped out. It was Billy, the youngest and most impulsive member of the group. He lit a cigarette with shaky hands, his eyes darting nervously as if he expected someone to jump out of the shadows. Marcus watched him for a long moment, noting the way he paced, the way his fingers twitched. Billy was a follower, not a leader, but followers could still be unpredictable. Marcus followed him at a distance as Billy wandered down the street, eventually ending up at a small dive bar. It was one of those places where the floors were sticky, the lighting was dim, and the regulars all knew each other by name. Billy slid onto a stool at the bar, ordering a drink and chatting with the bartender. Marcus didn't go inside. Instead, he stood across the street, leaning casually against a lamppost, his eyes scanning the surroundings. He wasn't just watching Billy. He was watching everyone. He saw how the bartender glanced at the door every time it opened, as if expecting trouble. He noticed the way a group of men in the corner talked in low voices, their heads close together. Everyone here had a story, a secret, and Marcus knew how to read between the lines. It was a skill that had saved his life more times than he could count. When Billy finally left the bar, Marcus followed him again, keeping to the shadows. Billy didn't notice a thing. He was too drunk, too distracted, stumbling his way back toward Jared's house. By the time he reached the driveway, Marcus was gone, melting back into the night like he had never been there. But his mind was working, piecing together the dynamics of the group, the cracks in their armor. Meanwhile, back at the Greyback's garage, Jared was holding court. The rest of the crew sat around him, drinking and laughing, their voices rising and falling in a chaotic symphony of bravado and ignorance. They were still riding the high from the night before, convinced they had won. Jared leaned back in his chair, smirking as he recounted the fire, exaggerating his role in the chaos for the sake of his audience. "You should have seen his face," Jared said, though he hadn't actually seen Marcus that night. "Bet he's halfway out of town by now, scared out of his mind." The others laughed, nodding along, but there was a tension in the room that Jared either didn't notice or chose to ignore. Tom, the lanky one, shifted uncomfortably in his seat. He had been quiet all night, barely touching his beer. When Jared turned his attention to him, his tone was sharp, almost accusing. "What's your problem, Tom?" "You scared too." Tom shook his head quickly, but the hesitation was enough to draw the group's attention. He didn't answer right away, his eyes darting toward the floor. "It's just, I don't know, man," Tom said finally, his voice low. "What if he's not like we think he is? What if he's dangerous?" The room fell silent for a moment, the air thick with unspoken doubts. Jared laughed, but it sounded forced, like he was trying to convince himself as much as the others. "Dangerous, that guy," Jared scoffed. "He's nothing. Just some loner who thought he could move here and do whatever he wanted. We showed him who's boss." But even as he spoke, Jared couldn't shake the nagging feeling that Tom might be right. Something about Marcus had unsettled him from the beginning, though he would never admit it out loud. There was a quiet confidence in the way Marcus carried himself, a kind of strength that didn't need to be announced. Jared pushed the thought aside, focusing instead on maintaining his image. He couldn't afford to show weakness, not to his crew, and certainly not to Marcus. As the night wore on, the Greybacks eventually drifted off, heading home one by one. Jared stayed behind, sitting alone in the dimly lit garage. He told himself he wasn't worried, but the truth was harder to ignore in the silence. He glanced at the door, half expecting it to burst open, but nothing happened. Still, the uneasy feeling lingered. Across town, Marcus sat in his motel room, going over his notes. He had mapped out their movements, their habits, and their weaknesses. He knew which buttons to push, which threads to pull to unravel the group from the inside out. This wasn't just about protecting himself anymore. It was about making sure the Greybacks never did this to anyone else again. Marcus leaned back in his chair, staring at the ceiling. He thought of the town, of the people who had looked the other way, while the Greybacks terrorized their neighbors. He thought of the fear in their eyes, the way they avoided confrontation. This wasn't just about a house or a group of men with too much hate and not enough sense. It was about standing up to something bigger, something that had festered in the shadows for too long. As the first light of dawn crept over the horizon, Marcus closed his notebook and stood. There was still work to be done, but he was ready. The Greybacks thought they were hunters, but they didn't realize they had become the prey. The nights in Hartsville had grown colder, and with each passing day, the tension in the town became almost tangible. Word of Marcus's burned house had spread quickly, though most of the townsfolk stayed silent, pretending they hadn't noticed the plumes of smoke or the fire trucks rushing down the streets. It was easier that way, easier to avoid the trouble that always seemed to follow the Greybacks. But the silence wasn't just avoidance. For many, it was fear. Everyone knew the Greybacks were dangerous in their own way, but no one dared stand up to them. Until now. Marcus was no longer just a man rebuilding his life. He was a storm waiting to break, and the Greybacks had no idea they were standing at the center of it. The first crack in their facade came 3 nights later. Jared woke up to the sound of a loud thud outside his house. He bolted upright, heart pounding, and grabbed the baseball bat he kept next to his bed. When he stepped onto the porch, the night was eerily stilled, save for the sound of his breathing. He scanned the yard, his eyes narrowing as they adjusted to the darkness. And then he saw it. A small package sat in the middle of the driveway, wrapped neatly with twine. There was no note, no explanation, just a sense of dread that settled in Jared's chest like a heavy weight. He approached cautiously, bat in hand, and bent down to inspect it. The box wasn't large, just big enough to hold. What? He hesitated, his hand hovering over the twine. Then, against his better judgment, he pulled it loose. Inside was a single photograph. It was old, grainy, and black and white. Jared recognized it immediately. It was his grandfather, back in his younger days, standing with a group of men in front of a truck with the greyback's old insignia painted on the side. But it wasn't the picture that sent a chill down Jared's spine. It was the red X scrawled across his grandfather's face. Jared dropped the box and stumbled back, his pulse racing. He didn't know how Marcus could have gotten that photo or why he had it at all, but one thing was clear. Marcus wasn't afraid of him. By morning, the greybacks were gathered in Jared's garage, the air thick with unease. Tom and Billy sat on the battered couch, exchanging nervous glances, while Jared paced back and forth, the veins in his neck bulging with frustration. "This is him messing with us," Jared growled. "He thinks he can scare us, but we're not going to let him. Right?" His voice rose as he looked at the others, but the conviction in his words wasn't mirrored in their faces. Tom shifted uncomfortably, his foot tapping against the floor. Billy stared at the ground, his hands fidgeting with the edge of his jacket. "Maybe we pushed too far," Tom said quietly, barely meeting Jared's glare. "Burning down his house. I mean, what if he's not like the others? What if he's dangerous?" Jared slammed his fist on the workbench, the sound echoing through the garage. "You sound like a coward," he snapped. "He's just some guy. We made our point, and now he's trying to scare us. That's all this is." But even as he spoke, Jared couldn't shake the unease creeping through him. Something about Marcus's silence was more unsettling than any confrontation could have been. There was no yelling, no threats, just calculated moves that left Jared and his crew questioning their own decisions. That same night, Billy found a similar package on the front porch of his small apartment. Unlike Jared, he didn't have the courage to open it. Instead, he shoved it into the trash, locking the door and double-checking the windows before retreating to his bedroom. He lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, his mind racing with possibilities. The package had been so ordinary, so unassuming, yet its very presence filled him with dread. Elsewhere in town, Marcus was watching, not from a distance, but up close. He wasn't just tracking their movements anymore. He was letting them feel the weight of his presence, a silent reminder that they were being watched. He left no fingerprints, no traceable evidence, just a growing sense of paranoia that slowly chipped away at their confidence. Tom, always the most anxious of the group, was the next to crack. He started skipping the nightly gatherings at Jared's garage, claiming he wasn't feeling well. But the truth was written all over his face. He was scared. The others noticed his absence, but no one said much. They were too preoccupied with their own unease, each of them wondering when Marcus would make his next move. For Marcus, this was all part of the plan. He didn't need to fight them head-on to win. He just needed to unravel them, to make them question their strength, their loyalty, their own minds. He had learned long ago that fear was the most effective weapon of all. It wasn't about brute force, it was about control. And the greybacks were slowly losing theirs. By the time the weekend rolled around, the group was barely holding together. Jared was more volatile than ever, snapping at the others and drinking heavily to calm his nerves. Billy had become reclusive, avoiding even his closest friends. And Tom, always on the edge of panic, was considering leaving town altogether. But the final straw came on Saturday night. Jared, desperate to reassert control, decided they needed to confront Marcus directly. He rallied the group, his voice full of false bravado, promising that they would finish this once and for all. The others hesitated, but Jared's anger was contagious, and eventually they agreed. They piled into Jared's truck, the engine roaring as they sped toward the edge of town. But when they reached Marcus' motel, the parking lot was empty. The room he had rented was dark, the blinds drawn tightly shut. Jared slammed the truck door and marched up to the office, demanding answers from the sleepy clerk behind the desk. The man shrugged, his expression indifferent. "He checked out this morning," the clerk said. Didn't say where he was going. Jared's jaw tightened, his fists clenching at his sides. He stormed back to the truck, his frustration boiling over. The others sat in uneasy silence, waiting for Jared to decide their next move. But before he could speak, his phone buzzed. He pulled it out of his pocket, frowning as he opened the message. It was a video sent from an unknown number. Jared hesitated, his thumb hovering over the play button, before finally pressing it. The video was shaky, the kind of footage you'd expect from a phone camera. But the image was clear enough. It showed the interior of Jared's garage, the place they had spent countless nights plotting and drinking. And in the center of the frame was something that made Jared's blood run cold. A single, unlit candle sitting on the workbench, surrounded by a circle of photographs. Each photo was of one of the greybacks, their faces crossed out in red. The message was clear. Jared's hand trembled as he gripped the phone tighter, his eyes fixed on the flickering image on the screen. The garage, their supposed stronghold, was now a stage for Marcus's silent message. The unlit candle seemed to taunt him, a promise of something yet to come. The others crowded around, their faces pale in the glow of the phone's screen. Billy muttered something under his breath, but no one paid attention. The only sound was the hum of the truck's engine and the heavy breathing of 4 men who had just realized they were being outplayed. Without a word, Jared shoved the phone into his pocket and climbed into the driver's seat. His jaw was clenched so tightly it looked as though he might shatter his teeth. The others followed, but the usual bravado was gone. They were silent, each lost in their thoughts as Jared drove, his hands gripping the wheel hard enough to make his knuckles turn white. He didn't head back to the garage. Instead, he drove aimlessly through the town, his mind racing. Jared had always considered himself untouchable, the one calling the shots, but Marcus had flipped the script. This wasn't just retaliation. This was calculated, methodical. And it wasn't just about Jared anymore. Marcus had made it personal, driving every member of the Greybacks into the spotlight. "Where are we going?" Tom finally asked, his voice small and shaky. "Nowhere," Jared snapped. "We're staying out until I figure this out." Billy shifted uncomfortably in his seat, glancing out the window. "Maybe he's just trying to scare us," he offered, though his tone betrayed his own doubts. "Like mind games or something." "Mind games don't explain how he got into the garage," Tom shot back. "I locked it myself before we left." The weight of Tom's words hung heavy in the air. Jared's grip on the wheel tightened further, and his foot pressed harder on the gas. He couldn't show weakness, not now. The group was already fracturing, and if he lost control completely, Marcus wouldn't even have to lift a finger to finish them off. The truck finally screeched to a stop outside an old warehouse on the outskirts of town. It was a relic from Hartsville's industrial days, long abandoned and forgotten. Jared killed the engine and turned to face the group, his expression hard. "We lay low here tonight," he said firmly. "No phones, no lights. He can't find us if we don't leave a trail." The others exchanged uneasy glances but didn't argue. They filed into the warehouse, their footsteps echoing the cavernous space. It smelled of dust and rust, the kind of place that felt like it had been holding its breath for decades. Jared found a corner to settle into, pulling out his phone one last time to check the video. He watched it again, his eyes scanning for any detail he might have missed. Then the second twist hit. Just as he was about to pocket the phone, it buzzed again. Another message. Jared hesitated, his thumb hovering over the notification. The others watched him, their tension palpable. Finally, he opened it. This time, It wasn't a video. It was a live stream. The screen showed a shaky view of Jared's garage again, but now it was empty. No candle, no photographs, just the hollow space lit by the flicker of the security light outside. Then the camera began to move. Slowly, deliberately, it panned to the right, revealing the side door. It was open, swinging gently in the night breeze. "Is this alive?" Billy asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Jared didn't answer. His breath caught as the camera moved again, this time toward the workbench. Something new had been placed there. A small radio, its red power light blinking steadily. The camera zoomed in, focusing on a note taped to the top. Asterisk asterisk, play me asterisk asterisk. The stream ended abruptly, leaving the screen black. Jared's pulse thundered in his ears. He stood abruptly, pacing the length of the warehouse. The others looked to him for direction, but he had nothing to give them. He didn't know what Marcus' next move was or how to counter it. For the first time, Jared felt the full weight of being hunted. Meanwhile, Marcus watched from his own vantage point. He knew exactly where the greybacks were holed up, though they would never guess how. Every move he made was intentional, every step designed to push them further into their own paranoia. He didn't need brute force to bring them down, just time, patience, and the knowledge that fear could break even the strongest facade. Back in the warehouse, Jared's phone buzzed once more. He snatched it up, ready to throw it against the wall, but what he saw made him freeze. It was a single text message, sent from the same unknown number. Asterisk asterisk, nowhere is safe asterisk asterisk. Tom let out a nervous laugh that bordered on hysterical. This guy is in our heads, man. He's everywhere and nowhere. What do we even do? Jared didn't answer. He couldn't. His confidence, his power, his carefully constructed image, all of it was crumbling faster than he could hold it together. And somewhere out there, Marcus was watching, waiting, and planning his next move. The night dragged on in the warehouse, the tension thick enough to suffocate. Jared paced relentlessly, his boots scuffing against the concrete floor, while the others sat in uneasy silence. Every creak, every distant sound seemed amplified, making them jump. Jared's phone hadn't buzzed again, but the lack of contact was almost worse than another message. The silence felt like Marcus's way of saying he didn't need to do anything more. He already owned their fear. Tom finally broke the silence, his voice trembling. "We can't stay here forever. He knows where we are, doesn't he? That message. Nowhere is safe. He's playing with us." Jared shot him a sharp look, his face twisted with frustration. "And what do you suggest? Run? Hide? You think he won't find us no matter where we go?" Billy, who had been uncharacteristically quiet, stood up suddenly. His expression was a mix of anger and desperation. "Maybe running isn't the answer, but sitting here waiting to be picked off isn't either. We need to face him." "Face him." Jared barked a bitter laugh. "And how do you propose we do that, Billy? He's been 3 steps ahead of us this entire time." But before anyone could respond, the warehouse was plunged into darkness. The faint hum of the single overhead light disappeared, leaving them in complete silence. The sound of their breathing filled the void, sharp and panicked. "What the hell?" Jared's voice cut off as a faint, rhythmic tapping echoed through the space. It was distant at first, almost imperceptible, but it grew louder, closer. It was coming from the entrance. Billy scrambled for his flashlight, fumbling with the switch. When the beam finally cut through the darkness, it revealed the source of the sound. A small object rolling across the floor toward them. The beam landed on it just as it stopped at Jared's feet. It was the radio from the video. The group froze, the implications sinking in. Somehow, Marcus had been here. Not earlier, not hours ago, but now. Jared's mind raced, trying to piece together how he could have slipped past them, how he could have known where they were. His instincts screamed at him to destroy the radio, but before he could act, it crackled to life. A voice, calm and steady, came through the speaker. It was unmistakably Marcus. "Running, hiding, fighting, none of it matters anymore. You've made your choices, and now you'll live with the consequences. The radio fell silent. Jared's hand trembled as he picked it up, his face pale with rage and fear. He's close, he growled. He has to be. But Marcus wasn't hiding. He was already in control. From the shadows, a figure emerged, silent, deliberate. Marcus stepped into the faint light of Billy's flashlight, his face calm but unreadable. He moved with the precision of someone who had spent years perfecting his every step. The greybacks froze, their bravado shattered as they came face to face with the man they had underestimated. "You think I didn't know about this place?" Marcus said, his voice low but commanding. "You've been predictable from the start." Jared's hand went to his belt, where he had a knife tucked away. He pulled it out, gripping it tightly as he took a step forward. "You don't scare me," he spat, though his voice betrayed his words. Marcus didn't flinch. Instead, he took another step closer, his gaze locked on Jared's. "If I wanted to hurt you, I could have done it 100 times over. But you're not worth the trouble. You see, Jared, you're already destroying yourselves." Billy and Tom exchanged uneasy glances, the truth of Marcus's words sinking in. The paranoia, the mistrust, the fear. It had all been tearing them apart long before Marcus ever showed up. Jared lunged suddenly, the knife aimed at Marcus's chest, but Marcus moved faster. In one fluid motion, he disarmed Jared, the knife clattering to the ground. He didn't hit him, didn't retaliate. Instead, he leaned in, his voice dropping to a whisper. "You've already lost." Jared stumbled back, his chest heaving with ragged breaths. The others didn't move, too stunned to react. Marcus straightened, his composure unshaken. He turned toward the exit, his movements deliberate, as though he had all the time in the world. Just before disappearing into the shadows, Marcus paused and looked back. "Consider this your only warning. Next time, I won't be so kind." And then he was gone. The silence in the warehouse was deafening. Jared sank to his knees, the weight of his actions finally catching up to him. Tom and Billy stood frozen, their minds reeling from what had just happened. They had been so sure of their power, their control, but Marcus had dismantled it all without breaking a sweat. In the days that followed, the greybacks dissolved. Jared disappeared from town, his pride too broken to face anyone. Tom left soon after, moving to a neighboring city and swearing to leave his past behind. Billy stayed, but he kept to himself, a shadow of the person he had been. As for Marcus, he returned to his quiet life. The events in Hartsville were a reminder of why he had left his past behind, but also a testament to the man he had become. He didn't need to prove his strength. It was in his control, his restraint. But the story didn't end there. Months later, Jared received a letter at an anonymous address. Inside was a single photograph, the same one of his grandfather with the red X. On the back, a handwritten note read, "****, you can't outrun your past ****.